The train shuddered to a halt. A German sergeant pressed his face against the slats of the cattle car, squinting at the sign through the gap. Alva, Oklahoma. He'd never heard of it. None of them had. The name meant nothing, just letters painted on weathered wood in a place so flat the horizon seemed to bend. A corporal from Leipzig, barely 20 and still nursing a shrapnel wound in his thigh, tried to stand. His legs buckled. 4 days in this box, sharing air with 60 men, had turned muscles to water. Outside, American guards waited with rifles loose at their hips, cigarettes dangling from their lips. One of them laughed at something. The sound cut through the August heat like something foreign. Woods County stretched around them in every direction. Wheat fields, dust, sky so wide it pressed down on your chest. The town of Alva sat at the county's center, a cluster of brick buildings and wooden storefronts that could have blown away in a hard wind. Population, maybe 4,000. Now add 3,000 German prisoners. The math didn't make sense. A private from Bremen, 19, acne still scattered across his jaw, stepped off the transport and just stared. He'd expected chains, guard towers, the architecture of punishment. Instead, he saw telephone poles and a water tower with the town's name painted in white. A church steeple in the distance. This was enemy territory? Railroad tracks had put Alva on the map decades before any of them were born. Steel veins connecting the Oklahoma plains to the wider world, laid down in the 1890s when the territory was still raw and hungry. Those same tracks now delivered human cargo. The War Department needed camps, and camps needed supply lines. Simple logistics. A German captain, 43, gray threading his temples, hands still steady from years of surgery before the uniform found him, understood immediately. Railroads meant efficiency. Efficiency meant survival. He watched crates being unloaded from a freight car, medical supplies, bandages, things that had been rumors on the Eastern Front. He said nothing, just watched. The camp had existed since 1943, 2 years of operation by the time most of these men arrived, though the compound felt both permanent and temporary. Barracks arranged in neat rows, guard towers casting long shadows, fences that seemed more like suggestions than barriers. U.S. War Department regulations governed everything. Wake times, meal portions, work assignments, recreation hours. A sergeant from Hamburg, his left hand missing 2 fingers from a factory accident years before the war, studied the posted rules on the first day. Geneva Convention protections, medical care provisions, religious services permitted. He read the words 3 times, then a 4th. The regulations promised things his own army had stopped promising years ago. None of them knew how long they'd stay. The war still burned across oceans, but here, in this flat stretch of Oklahoma dust, time moved differently. A guard walked past the fence line, nodded once at no one in particular, kept moving. The corporal from Leipzig tested his weight on his wounded leg. It held. The private from Bremen touched the wooden frame of his barracks door, running his thumb along the grain. Real wood. Clean. Somewhere behind them, the train whistled and pulled away, empty now, heading back east for another load. The sound faded. Silence settled. But silence in a place like this always carries questions. A colonel signed his name on July 19, 1943. The ink dried fast in the Oklahoma heat. With that signature, Camp Alva became something different from every other prisoner of war facility in the United States. This wasn't a camp for soldiers who'd simply surrendered. The Department of War had another purpose in mind, a dumping ground for the men nobody else wanted to hold, the worst of the worst, the true believers. They arrived in blacked-out train cars, shackles rattling against wooden benches, Nazi party leaders with soft hands and hard eyes, Gestapo agents who still carried themselves like they were the ones asking questions. A captain from Leipzig kept his chin raised as guards marched him through the gates, scanning the watchtowers like he was memorizing weaknesses. Fanatics, saboteurs, men who'd sworn blood oaths to ideologies that made American interrogators' skin crawl. Camp Alva collected them all, pressing them together behind barbed wire like something volatile waiting to ignite. The camp's medical wing stood apart from the main compound, segregated facilities. The brass had insisted on it. A young Army nurse from Oklahoma City walked those corridors every morning, her shoes clicking against concrete floors that smelled of bleach and something sharper underneath. She passed cells holding men who'd ordered mass executions, men who'd run torture programs across occupied Europe. Her hands never shook when she checked their pulses. The thermometer didn't care about ideology, neither did the infection spreading through a prisoner's leg. Nazi leaders received the same treatment as any other patient. That was the order. A medic named Patterson, barely 22 with a slight limp from a training accident, administered morphine to a Gestapo officer writhing from kidney stones. He didn't ask what the man had done in Poland. Didn't want to know. The syringe went in. The pain went out. Geneva Convention rules hung on the wall in plain English. None of the prisoners could read them, but the American staff could. Medical personnel provided care without discrimination. The words sounded simple. Living them felt like swallowing glass. Patterson stood outside the ward that night, smoking his third cigarette in an hour. The Oklahoma wind carried dust and the faint sound of German hymns from the barracks. Somewhere inside, a man who'd helped design concentration camps was sleeping peacefully, his fever broken by American penicillin. Patterson crushed a cigarette under his boot. Tomorrow he'd do it all again. The question nobody asked out loud hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. A guard from Texas squinted at the paperwork on his desk, running his thumb along the edge of a roster that listed more names than some towns back home. 425,871 prisoners. The number sat there like an accusation. Among them, 371,683 Germans, men who'd fired at Americans, bombed British cities, marched through France. Now they slept on American soil, ate American bread, watched American sunsets through barbed wire. The guard lit a cigarette and let the smoke curl toward the ceiling. His brother was still somewhere in Belgium. Heat was cheaper than coal. That simple arithmetic explained why most POW camps sprawled across the American South, where winter meant a light jacket instead of furnace crews working double shifts. A private from Georgia, barely 20 with sun-darkened forearms, walked the perimeter at Camp Aliceville. He'd never left Alabama before the war. Now he watched over men from Berlin, from Vienna, from places that existed only in his mother's atlas. The irony wasn't lost on him. These Germans were seeing more of America than he ever had. 175 main camps. That number alone could fill a ledger. But beneath each main camp, satellite operations branched outward. 511 branch camps scattered like seeds across farmland and forest. A quartermaster sergeant with ink-stained fingers tracked supplies flowing to all of them. Cotton for uniforms, lumber for barracks, coffee by the ton. Every U.S. state except 3 housed at least one camp. Nevada stayed empty. North Dakota, too. Vermont never saw a single German prisoner walk its soil. The sergeant wondered if those states felt lucky or forgotten. Not all prisoners wore the same invisible uniform. A chaplain from Boston, his collar frayed at the edges, walked between barracks that held men the army had separated from the rest. Nazi hardliners, true believers, men who still raised their arms in salute when they thought no one watched. The segregation camps existed because ideology was contagious, and the brass had learned that lesson the hard way. Across the country, Italian prisoners faced a different choice entirely. Volunteer for the Italian service units, work the army depots, mop hospital floors, harvest crops alongside American farmers, and earn something that couldn't be requisitioned. Better food, a little dignity. The chaplain had seen men wrestle with easier decisions. A German corporal from Stuttgart stood at a camp fence in Mississippi, watching fireflies blink in the summer darkness. He'd never seen them before. Back home, his wife didn't know where he was. The letter he'd written sat in a censor's pile, waiting. Somewhere in the camp, an Italian volunteer was learning to drive a tractor. Somewhere else, a guard was counting heads for the 3rd time that night. The war had made them all neighbors in a country none of them fully understood, and the fireflies kept blinking, indifferent to borders or uniforms or the mathematics of captivity. The corporal from Leipzig pressed his palm flat against the examination table. Cold steel, clean steel. He hadn't touched anything this clean in 14 months. A medic with wire-rimmed glasses and ink stains on his fingers flipped through a War Department circular, checking boxes on a form. Geneva Conventions required medical care for prisoners of war. The corporal knew this. He'd memorized Article 15 in a foxhole outside Anzio, repeating it like a prayer. Now American hands were reaching for a stethoscope instead of a rifle. The medic listened to his chest for 30 seconds, wrote something down and pointed to the next room. No questions about his unit, no interrogation, just the scratch of pen on paper. Camp Alva ran on paper. Circular number 154 spelled out everything. Who got treatment, when, how much. A captain from the Army Medical Corps kept a copy pinned above his desk, edges curling from Oklahoma humidity. He was 43, with a permanent squint from reading regulations in bad light. Every prisoner who walked through his door received exactly what the circular demanded, not more, not less. The captain had stopped thinking about who these men were. He thought about compliance, about signatures, about the inspector who'd arrive next month with a clipboard and cold eyes. A private from Bremen shuffled into the infirmary at 0600, coughing like gravel scraping metal. He'd been doing this for 3 weeks. The nurse, a woman from Tulsa with calloused hands and no patience for excuses, handed him the same government-issue cough syrup she'd give any American soldier. International law, official U.S. policy, words typed on documents 1,000 miles away. But here, in this room that smelled of iodine and floor wax, they meant a German prisoner got the same small brown bottle as the guard who'd escorted him. The private turned it over in his hands. Read the English label he couldn't understand. Drank it anyway. Sanitation inspections happened every Thursday. A sergeant from the camp's medical staff walked the wards with a checklist longer than his arm. Latrines scrubbed, bedding changed, instruments sterilized at temperatures specified by military public health regulations, regulations written for American bases, American hospitals, American soldiers. Now they covered men who'd worn different uniforms 6 months ago. The sergeant marked his boxes, checked his temperatures, noted the ratio of beds to patients. His handwriting was small and precise. He'd learned that precision mattered more than opinions. Opinions got you reassigned. Precision kept you invisible. A medic named Rawlings stood at the supply cabinet, counting aspirin tablets. 47 prisoners on his roster today. 47 men who'd shot at boys from his hometown. His brother was buried somewhere in France. Rawlings counted the tablets again, made sure the number matched the regulation, locked the cabinet, walked to the first bed. The German lying there had a fever of 103 and eyes that wouldn't meet his. Rawlings checked the man's pulse, recorded it on the chart, and moved to the next bed. The forms didn't ask how he felt about any of it. Nobody did. A corporal from Bremen stood shirtless in the inspection line, arms raised. The American doctor pressed a stethoscope to his chest without flinching. During 1943 to 1945, German POWs at Camp Alva received medical treatment that included regular inspections and access to camp hospitals. The corporal hadn't seen a doctor in 14 months. His last physical exam happened in a bombed-out church outside Tunis, a medic checking for lice while shells cratered the road outside. Now fluorescent lights hummed above him. Clean hands touched his lymph nodes. He kept waiting for the catch. The sick wards smelled of bleach and something almost forgotten, soap. Within these U.S. POW camps, the medical care system was organized to include sick wards for ill prisoners. A private from Stuttgart lay in bed 17, his fever breaking for the first time in 4 days. The nurse changed his sheets twice daily. Back in Africa, he'd watched 3 men die from dysentery in a foxhole because there was nothing else to do. Here, a thermometer appeared every 4 hours. He stared at the ceiling tiles, counted them, lost count, started again. Steel instruments clinked against enamel trays. Surgical wards were available for those who required operations or more intensive procedures. A sergeant from Leipzig needed shrapnel removed from his thigh, metal that had been there since Kasserine Pass. The surgeon, a young captain with wire-rimmed glasses and hands like a pianist, worked for 3 hours. Anesthesia, actual anesthesia. The sergeant woke to stitches instead of a leather belt between his teeth. He touched the bandage, white gauze, no blood soaking through. Dental clinics formed another part of this system, providing dental care to the prisoners. A private from Cologne sat rigid in the chair, jaw clenched, 7 teeth, gone to rot. The dentist from Oklahoma worked methodically, speaking in broken German he'd learned from a phrase book. Cotton packed the empty spaces afterward. The private walked out slower than he'd walked in, tongue probing the gaps, 2 years of chewing on one side. Finished. He ran his tongue across his gums again. The absence felt strange, almost like relief. Camp Alva maintained a pharmacy that supplied medicines to German POW patients under medical supervision. A medic with a clipboard counted bottles on wooden shelves, aspirin, sulfa drugs, iodine, bandages stacked in neat rows. A corporal from Frankfurt watched him through the dispensary window. Back home, his mother bartered her wedding ring for antibiotics that turned out to be chalk. Here, strangers handed him pills and asked nothing in return. He swallowed them dry. The question sat in his throat long after the medicine went down. The Swiss inspector moved through the ward without speaking. His clipboard caught the light. Red Cross inspections of prisoner of war medical facilities took place regularly at various camps, including Camp Alva, and this man had seen dozens of them. He paused at each bed, checking linens, counting syringes, noting the color of iodine in glass bottles. A German corporal from Stuttgart watched him from beneath half-closed lids, pretending to sleep. The inspector's fountain pen scratched against paper. Nobody breathed normally when that pen was moving. These inspections focused specifically on the medical facilities available to the prisoners, and the Swiss took their neutrality like a religion. Every thermometer accounted for, every bandage roll logged. A nurse from Oklahoma, her shoes worn thin at the heels, handed over inventory sheets without being asked. She'd learned the routine. The inspector checked expiration dates on morphine vials, ran his finger along windowsills testing for dust. He found none. Camp Alva's medical staff had scrubbed the place raw the night before, and their knuckles still showed it. At Camp Alva, U.S. medical staff provided treatment to German prisoners of war with the same instruments they'd use on their own boys. Dr. Harrison, a surgeon from Philadelphia with silver threading his temples, stitched a gash on a Wehrmacht private's forearm. Steady hands, no hesitation. The private couldn't have been older than 20, still had a farmer's calluses on his palms. He watched the American doctor work and said nothing. Some silences carry more weight than conversation. They handled a range of ailments among the POWs, from common colds to injuries sustained during wartime, and the parade of broken bodies never seemed to end. A sergeant from Bremen shuffled in with pneumonia rattling in his chest like dice in a cup. A corporal needed 3 teeth pulled, infection spreading to his jaw. A private with shrapnel still working its way out of his shoulder blade. The medics documented everything: temperature charts, medication logs, recovery timelines, paper trails that would outlast every man in the building. German POWs who were admitted to the Camp Alva hospitals were formally documented and then regularly monitored by the camp's medical officers until discharge or transfer. A young medic with ink-stained fingers updated charts at midnight, his desk lamp the only light in the corridor. Names became numbers became names again. The Swiss inspector had moved on to the next camp by morning, but his report would travel further than any of them. And reports, once filed, have a way of outliving the truth they were meant to capture. A corporal from Leipzig pressed his palm flat against his forehead, checking his own temperature for the 3rd time that morning. His skin felt hot. Maybe. He couldn't tell anymore. Camp Alva had built a medical care system organized to address prisoner health needs during internment, but that meant something different when you were the one sweating through your shirt at dawn. The infirmary sat at the compound's edge, white paint peeling near the doorframe, staffed by American medics who moved with the efficiency of men who'd seen worse. A private with ink-stained fingers from writing letters home gestured toward the examination line. It stretched past the barracks. Nobody complained out loud. Isolation changed men faster than bullets. A key part of this system was the effort to isolate contagious diseases within the camp, and the quarantine ward proved it every day. Behind a second fence, separated by 30 yards of Oklahoma dust, sat wooden structures where the sick waited alone. A sergeant from Bremen, his voice reduced to a rasp from tuberculosis, watched healthy prisoners through the wire mesh. He'd been a school teacher before the war. Now he counted the days by meal trays sliding under his door. The American nurse who brought his medication never flinched when he coughed. She just marked something on her clipboard and moved to the next bed. Fear travels faster than fever. These isolation measures were intended to prevent disease outbreaks among the prisoners, and every man understood the stakes without being told. 1 case of typhus could become 50. 50 could become 300. A medic from rural Missouri, barely 22 with calluses from a previous life on a farm, explained the protocols through a translator. His hands never stopped moving, pointing to the hygiene stations, the latrines, the washing schedules. Some prisoners had survived Stalingrad. They knew what epidemic looked like in a crowded space. The quarantine fence wasn't punishment. It was mathematics. Thursday mornings meant the doctors came through. Health inspections were built into Camp Alva's regular operating procedures, and the routine became its own kind of clock. Men lined up shirtless in the mess hall, ribs visible on the ones who'd arrived underweight. An American physician with silver-gray temples and steady eyes worked down the row, pressing stethoscopes to chests that had once worn iron crosses. He paused at a private from Stuttgart whose breathing rattled like wind through broken shutters. Pneumonia, maybe worse. The private stared at the ceiling while the doctor wrote orders for a chest x-ray. Nobody told him what the doctor suspected. Through these inspections, the camp aimed to monitor and support the well-being of the POWs, but the men being examined understood something else entirely. Every temperature reading was a verdict. Every blood pressure check asked a question they couldn't answer. A young soldier, 19 at most with a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles, watched the medics pack their instruments after rounds. Back in Germany, his grandmother had died waiting for a doctor who never came. Here, strangers listened to his heartbeat like it mattered. He didn't know what to do with that. The inspection would come again next Thursday. Same time. Same questions, no one spoke aloud. A corporal from Stuttgart stared at the ceiling tiles above his infirmary bed, counting them for the 3rd time that morning. Medical records from camp Alva provide information about the care given to German prisoners of war. The American nurse checking his pulse didn't flinch when she saw the Wehrmacht eagle tattooed on his forearm. She wrote something on her clipboard, moved to the next bed. He kept counting tiles. These records showed that treatments were administered for a range of conditions. A private with a jaw infection sat in the dental chair, gripping the armrests like they might save him from drowning. Appendectomies, hernias, tuberculosis screenings that took half a day. A medic from Oklahoma worked through lunch, his coffee going cold on the windowsill 3 times before he remembered it existed. The line of men waiting never seemed to shrink, it just changed faces. They document medical attention for physical health problems among the POWs, frostbite damage from the Eastern Front, shrapnel wounds that had healed wrong and needed breaking again. A sergeant from Bremen, maybe 40 but looking 60, had his leg reset without anesthesia because supplies ran short that week. He bit down on a leather strap, didn't scream. The doctor's hand shook afterward. The sergeant's didn't. The same records also indicate that psychological conditions were treated at the camp. A young private, 19 at most, sat in a corner of the ward and wouldn't speak. Hadn't spoken in 6 weeks. A psychiatrist from Chicago visited twice monthly, taking notes in a leather journal worn soft at the edges. Night terrors, paralytic episodes, men who flinched at doors closing. The doctor learned to knock softly. It helped, sometimes. Together, these details show that both physical and psychological issues were addressed for German POWs at Camp Alva. A corporal with burn scars across both hands started attending group sessions in the mess hall every Thursday. He never spoke during them, but he showed up. Week after week, he showed up. The files grew thicker, the questions they raised grew heavier, and some wounds don't show up in medical records at all.